Education Strategic Planning Committee of May 22nd. Good morning. I'm Woody Hunt, Chairman of the Higher Education Strategic Planning Committee. It's once again my pleasure to welcome all of you and thank you for your time and your commitment and for your leadership to help our state achieve an outstanding higher education. As you know, our committee is charged with providing the coordinating board advice and recommendations regarding the board's development of the next long-term strategic plan for Texas higher education. For our meeting today, each of you has a packet at your place containing the agenda for today's meeting, the minutes from our meeting on April 15th, the bios of our presenters, hard copies of our presenters' PowerPoint presentations, our small group discussion questions for our work groups. After the approval of the minutes from our April 15th meeting, we will hear from Dr. Andreas Sliker, and who I think we just saw at least some of us on the screen, of the OECD via Skype regarding international benchmarking as done by the OECD. After a discussion with Professor Sliker, we'll take a brief 5-minute break so that the coordinating board's technical experts can connect with Dr. Jeff Stroll of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. Finally, after Dr. Stroll's presentation and our discussions with him, in both cases, I hope that we'll have ability to interact and ask questions of the presenters. We'll break into small facilitated discussion groups. Each group will discuss and hopefully reach small group consensus on recommended answers to the questions regarding our benchmark goal for 2030 and whether we recommend including the goal of workforce success in the next long-term higher education plan for Texas. We're using these facilitated small group discussions so that we're sure to hear from all committee members. While we're talking and listening, please continue to give some thought to how the 5, 10, 15-year needs of Texas can better be addressed by state government and by our higher education institutions and programs. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. First, I need a motion to approve the minutes from our April 15th meeting.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Any objection? None heard. Minutes are approved. Now I'd like to, are we ready to bring Dr. Sliker onto the Connect? While you're connecting, I'd like to begin our discussion today by introducing Professor Andreas Sliker from the OECD, who will be joining us hopefully via Skype from Paris, France. Professor Sliker's bio is in your packet of materials, but for those who are joining us via the web, Andreas Sliker is Acting Director for the Directorate of Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Secretary General. He also provides strategic oversight over the OECD's work on the development and utilization of skills and their social and economic outcomes. Before joining the OECD, Professor Sliker was Director for Analysis at the International Association for Educational Achievement. He studied physics in Germany, received a degree in mathematics and statistics in Australia. He's a recipient of numerous honors and awards and holds an honorary professorship at the University of Heidelberg. And we had him on the screen. look good for a while. Yeah, I mean, you told me it was really good.
Thank you, David. I asked staff to send every member of this committee a copy of an article that appeared in Sunday's New York Times. It's called Who Gets to Graduate, and it's pretty much about what's going on at the University of Texas at Austin, and it deals with what I consider to be one
Raymond, I think we have Dr. Schleicher.
Okay. I'll stop.
Dr. Schleicher, can you hear us?
I can hear you well, but I don't think you...
Okay, there you are. We hear you now, Mr.
We hear you.
Okay.
Hear you and see you. I want to welcome you. I've already read your bio to our committee. I'm Woody Hunt. I'm chairman of the Strategic Planning Committee for the Higher Education Coordinating Board, State of Texas, USA. We appreciate your time this morning. I had a chance to interact with the OECD several years ago with John Apuca in the Paso del Norte region of the U.S., northern Mexico and southern New Mexico, and had a very good outcome there. And so I have a personal experience that was very favorable and look forward to your presentation today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your interest in our work at the OECD. I'm going to try to link in my screen so that I can show you the slides. I hope you can now see my presentation. Perfect. So let me just introduce sort of the kind of questions I wanted to touch on in my presentation. The first, of course, is let's look at the future of education providers, both traditional institutions, but also the innovators that we see around the world. And at the very same time, we need to keep in mind learner ownership, formal learning in institutions, but also the kind of informal learning that is emerging in many countries, both. So, on the one hand, of course, the question that we're all struggling with is, what do we do with the ongoing expansion of higher education that we see throughout the world? Actually, the United States is more sort of at the low end of expansion, but in most countries we see sort of an unabated expansion of higher education participation. The second question I wanted to touch on is how successful institutions, higher education institutions, engage with new and evolving learner needs. Coming to the more innovative side, who can make a difference to closing skill gaps? In many of our countries, we see this kind of toxic mix. On the one hand, we have university graduates on the street looking for employment, and at the very same time, an increasing share of employers say they cannot find the people with the skills they need. And last but not least, the question, of course, is can we extend mass education for some, a kind of higher education model that has predominated for long, to the kind of personalized learning for all that people talk about these days. Let's start with the easy question, expansion. First of all, when you look at the global composition of the talent pool, we have about 39 million 55 to 64-year-old people with a university qualification or another type of tertiary qualification. Now, when you look at the young population going into higher education, it's more than twice that number. Now that tells us sort of something about the quantitative expansion that we have seen across successive generations. And there's also been a shift in the composition of the talent pool. If you look at the people leaving the labor force today, you have about 36% Americans. If you look at the young population entering the labor market, the United States is around 21%. And that's not because there are fewer Americans going to university, but simply because many other countries have seen a much faster growth. You can see obviously China here, but also other countries, very significant increases in the relative market share of higher education. So big shift in numbers, but also in composition. I just want to sort of highlight the pace of change that we have seen in another kind of way. On the vertical axis, you see the price. Now, basically, cost per student in each country. On the horizontal axis, you see the tertiary type A graduation rate. That's basically college, 4-year degrees. Those are the two dimensions here. And now I bring sort of the source of funds into this. Now, the size of the bubble represents basically where the money comes from. The larger the bubble, the more successful a country in generating money from private sources. The United States, you can see here, number one in terms of the graduate supply, number one in terms of investing per student, and number one in terms of mobilizing a large share of resources through private sources. The only thing I want to highlight here that this was in 1995. Some time ago. And when you look at the same picture in the year 2000, you could see a very different scenario. In the year 2000, the United States was no longer number one, but it was at the frontier of many countries, actually providing lots of people with university qualifications. And the world didn't stop in the year 2000, as some people had predicted. You could actually see how things moved on: 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10. So basically what you can see here is that over a very limited time span, now you talk about a decade, a bit more than a decade, the relative position of countries has changed dramatically. All countries have moved somewhere to the right, now getting more people to complete better qualifications. But some countries have moved much faster than others. The United Kingdom, Poland, sort of with a very, very rapid pace of expansion. And you can see why most countries have moved to the right side. The United States has mainly moved upwards. The cost for higher education have risen dramatically in the United States, but participation hasn't increased as it did in other countries. This is just sort of a slide showing you the pace of change. International education, also really interesting. You can see here the evolution in the number of students enrolled in university, where they come from. Worldwide, you can see basically we've seen almost a doubling of foreign students. In the OECD area, this is the industrialized world, you can see most of that is actually picked up in our countries. In Europe, also rapid increase, the G20 countries, and then North America, still a very significant share of foreign students, but most of the growth has actually been in the European area and other G20 countries. But the overall message is there's going to be, there is an ongoing stream, an increasing stream of international students looking for places to study in the industrialized world. You can look at this by country of destination. Where do students go to? Number one, the United States, almost 17%. The UK, number 13, following very closely. And then the big surprise is Australia, a very small country, but picking up about 7% of international students. In a sense, very, very successful in sort of mobilizing foreign student participation. Also, this is something that has not been static. In fact, we've seen very significant changes on that. When you look at the trends, for example, this is the picture in 2010, the market share, and that's the picture in 2000. So you could see, for example, countries like Germany or the United States have significantly lost in market shares, not in absolute numbers, but in relative terms, while other countries have seen further increases. The UK and Australia are good examples, or the Russian Federation. More people going into those countries, significant increase. So again, we have the same story. We have a rising number of students studying internationally, but there are changes in the countries they choose as places for study. So the big question out of all of this is, more and more people getting a university degree. Is there going to be a massive deflation of the labor market value of qualifications? That's sort of the big question that is in the minds of many of us, including students today. Is this expansion going to pay for people? And the answer to this is actually quite encouraging. In most countries, the answer is clearly yes. If you look, for example, for a man, you can see on this chart if you are going to university, you pay more social contributions, now you pay more tuition, you pay more, you have a high share of foregone earnings, money you do not earn while you study. In fact, that's for students these days the biggest cost. We often forget that it's not tuition, it's foregone earnings. Then there comes a kind of income tax effect. Now you are more qualified, you end up paying more taxes. That's true particularly in countries like the United States. And there are other kinds of social contribution effects. Now those are the costs. And you can see they're adding up. And in the United States, this is well above $100,000 on average per person. But there are also benefits. And you can see here basically that's the gross earnings benefits and that's the employment benefits. And in most countries, those benefits have actually risen over the last years, despite the massive increase in numbers. It's not true for the United States. Those benefits have actually remained stable. But overall, across the board, you can basically say, so far, the expansion in higher education is still paying off. That's why more people go. That's why more people pay for their tuition. And you can put that up in numbers. You can now do a very interesting question the other way around, This is the number I showed you before. That's what people gain. Private net returns, we call that. But, of course, governments earn too. As you could see from the slide before, governments earn more taxes from people with higher qualifications. And that's actually a very significant number as well. And in fact, one of the things that I can say that in the case of the United States, the government still makes about $100,000 profit from any university students. That's basically what governments get more out of a graduate than what they pay for a graduate. And that's true for most other countries as well. Even countries, that's a very interesting point, even countries that pay for higher education largely or exclusively publicly, even for those countries, the fiscal returns still tend to be higher than the fiscal expenditure. And if you take those things together, the individual returns and the fiscal returns, you can conclude that there is, at the moment, every incentive for people to continue to invest in getting more degrees, and that's what we see of labor market. One question that we always ask ourselves is, who benefits from this? Is higher education actually directly benefiting the economy, or is it more a consumption good, something that people, individuals benefit from? And you can actually see a chart here looking at the drivers of GDP growth over the last decade. Now, where has economic growth come from? That's the total number that we have seen. You can see the United States sort of in the middle. That's what we see from university graduates. And this is from people with lower qualifications. So one of the things that you can see is that in a country like the United States, about half of the income growth that the United States has seen over the last decade actually has been driven by university level or other tertiary qualifications. And that's a very important message that actually, yes, higher education is a consumption good. People have personal benefits out of it, but it's also a big driver of the economic progress that we are seeing in most of the countries. Now, the question, of course, is who should pay for what, when, and how. In many countries, that's a very sort of fiercely debated issue. What's the role of the private? What's the role of enterprise sector? What's the role of governments? And so on. And this big expansion of higher education means that has put a lot of pressure, particularly on public sources of funds in many, many countries. Let's have a look at some of the trends. This is actually the change in spending that we have seen on higher education. You can see in virtually all countries that spending has gone upwards. Basically, governments have put a lot more money into higher education in 2010 than they did in 2005. True also for the United States, even though increase in spending hasn't been as dramatic as it is in some other countries. But of course, as I mentioned before, there's also been an increase in student numbers. More people going to universities in most countries. And as a result, when you look at spending per student, in the majority of countries, spending per student increased. But it's not true for all countries. Now, you can actually see that there is a number of countries where actually spending per student has actually declined. The United States is sort of on the border, but more on the decline side as well. When you look at this in another way, you can see basically tuition fees on the vertical axis, and then the share of students who get some form of scholarship or loan on the horizontal axis. And there are four interesting quadrants here. You can look at the corner in the green area here. These are the lucky students. You know, they don't pay tuition or very little, and they get a lot of public subsidies, basically for living expenditures. And these are all the Nordic countries in Europe. They basically invest a lot of public money into those people. And as I said before, actually they benefit like in the United States. They drive still a lot of kind of public benefits from this through their progressive taxes. Here you have the countries like the United States where people have to pay, but there is still a good access to public financing, scholarships and loans. But you also see that the United States has almost become a class in its own when it comes to the level of tuition. The level of tuition in the United States has risen to a level that it's actually unparalleled across any of the countries. And this is just average. Here you have countries like Japan and Korea where basically students have to pay tuition and they get no subsidies. That's actually basically puts the entire burden on families. And then here you have a group of countries, finally, that have said, you know, we don't charge tuition, but we also don't pay subsidies. What's interesting, the size of the bubble here shows you the graduation rate. And the people with no tuition, the countries with no tuition, are not necessarily the countries where you also have, you know, high output. So in our analysis, it's not tuition that becomes the main barrier to higher education participation. There are other barriers. I'm going to discuss them here. Let's go to the second topic. You know, how do institutions actually engage with new types of learner needs? I show you some interesting data from our survey of adult skills, where we actually look at the impact which skills, this is not degrees, this is directly measured skills, have actually on outcomes. And you can see the relationship with employment and wages is strong. Health, voluntary, political efficacy, even trust is quite closely related to the skills people have. And the United States is even better than other countries. It's a very interesting comparison. You look at the United States compared with other countries, the United States is no longer at the top in producing sort of largest number of graduates. But the United States economy is still doing really well in extracting value from degrees and qualifications. This data are coming from our test of adult skills, PEA. You may have heard about this. I just want to make one caveat here, and that is that qualifications, you know, the degrees you get in a university, do not always equal skills. That we directly say. I want to illustrate this here. If you take a student who did not complete high school in the United States, you can see they are not all low skilled. This is the middle half of the population, and you can see basically there's a whole range of skills people without a high school degree have. If you look at people with a high school qualification, they are more highly skilled. They do better on our test, but still there's a lot of overlap. And even if you add the people from college, you can see actually there's a lot of overlap between people with college degrees and people with high school degrees when it comes to the real skills. And that is because some people with high school actually continue to learn, continue to expand their skill base. So there are important issues that we need to take into account. But you can also do that across countries, and here the things gets really interesting. When you basically compare Japan with the United States, you can see that Japanese high school graduates come pretty close to American college graduates when it comes to things like numeracy, mathematics, or even problem-solving skills. So, you know, we cannot simply say a degree is a degree. Degrees mean something very different in different contexts, different countries, for different people. The relationship between the qualifications people have got and the actual skills they can demonstrate on our tests is actually far weaker than what any of us might want to wish. And I think that's sends in a very important message as well, that the signaling effects that we have are not always borne out in tests. Problem-solving skills in digital environments. We have tested the skills of people to solve basic digital problems. This is what you can see in the bar here, and the people who have advanced digital skills. And we all talk about the kind of flat world, internet society, and so on, but you can actually see there's only about 30% of the entire workforce that is comfortable in this digital world. And now I know what you're going to tell me. This is all about, older generations not keeping up with technology. But you can see a very similar picture actually also in the young population. And compare the United States and Korea. If you look among the older generation, both countries do the same. But if you look among the younger generation, you can see that Korea is significantly ahead of the United States. You can really see that how the intergenerational progress has been very different across countries. Why is that important? Why are high skills in problem solving so important? Well, here I'm tracking the employment of people with different skill levels. If you have so-so problem-solving skills, you can actually see that you've seen a relative decline in employment. If you have very low problem-solving skills, you actually keep your job. That's a very interesting finding, maybe counterintuitive for people. Why should people with low skills be better off than people with average skills? But the answer is our economies actually offer still a lot of jobs that do not require great skills. But the kind of skills that are easy to digitize, automate, and outsource in the middle range are more at threat. People call this the hollowing out of labor markets. And you can see actually it's only people with advanced problem-solving skills that have actually seen increases in employment. And this is again why the high end of the skill distribution has become so important. Let's go to the third topic. Who can make a systemic difference to closing the kind of skill gaps that we have, that I've been sort of talking about? Let's have a look at some data here. This chart shows you the share of people who report to be overqualified in the adult population. And then there's a share of people who say they're underqualified. Basically, they don't have the qualifications that people getting into the job would really need. And you look at the United States, it's about 20%. Now, 20% of the population basically says, I have a better qualification than what I actually need for my job. So people looking at this data say, and I've seen it a lot in the United States too, well, we've got too many university graduates on our streets. We are overeducated. That's the message you get when you look at degrees and qualifications. However, when you actually look at the actual skills of people, the picture looks very different. You can actually say that less than 10% of Americans have actually better skills than what they need at their jobs. So when you look at really this data on the actual skill distribution, the layer of skills in the United States is actually quite thin. There is not much sort of talent around that isn't already being utilized by the economy. You can look at this the other way around. The United States increasing its skill base could have a significant effect on economic and productivity use. So the message that people get from data on over and under qualification are actually quite distorted because they do not take into account the actual skills that people have. And you could see the answer in the slide that I presented to you before. Evidence on skill mismatch. What impact will it have for people? If you have high levels of skills and you have a job that is using those skills well, you're actually well off when you're 30 years old and you keep earning more and more. Your monthly wages actually go up over your life cycle. If you have a skill deficit, what I mean by this is you don't have the skills that your job actually needs. You earn less. You start with a lower salary because your employer is not going to pay you for things you don't know, but you keep growing in your earnings. If you have a skills surplus, it goes the other way around. And that's very important. People whose skills are not very well used actually lose out in the long term. And of course, people who don't have jobs using those skills, actually for them, it's even more pronounced. So you can actually hear again this polarization that we see in our labor markets. Skills have become the biggest drivers of the kind of inequalities that we see in our societies. The last point I really want to make is the question, and I have more questions here than actually answers in our data. Can we extend the kind of mass education for some typical education formal institutions to enabling people to learn when they want, where they want? All this debate that we have on MOOCs today, this unbundling of educational content, educational delivery, certification, accreditation, and so on. These are the big questions, I think, in everybody's mind. What data do we have on this? Just sort of a couple of points. When you actually look at the annual labor costs of, for example, employer-sponsored education, they're actually pretty low. In the United States, you talk about less than 0.5% of the GDP, and that compares with 1.6% for higher education. So actually, most of the highly skilled learning in the United States, and in fact in most countries, is still happening in the kind of higher education institutions. The amounts invested by people in learning outside institutions is really quite limited. Perhaps exceptions are in Norway, Germany, Denmark, United Kingdom, where that share is a bit higher, but even there is not really significant. So there's not that much of advanced learning that's currently going on outside higher education. Intergenerational mobility. Another important question in this, the dream of everybody, the American dream you could call it, is that, the children are better educated than their parents and they actually continue to move upwards the social ladder. They've tried to benchmark this as well. These are the people, this is the share of people where you can actually say that. We can say in the United States about 20% of the population now is better educated than the parents were. But that figure in the United States compares very low, for example, to countries like Poland and Ireland. One of the explanations is that the United States had traditionally a very strong higher education basis, whereas countries like Poland and Ireland have added to that in recent years. The other question is more worrying. Who actually moves downward? And you can see that is in the United States a quite significant share of people, in Germany too, Estonia too. Now there's significant numbers of people who actually are less well educated than their parents were. And then, of course, the majority of people stay where they were. But the bottom line of all of this is that in most countries, upward mobility is better than downward mobility. That's what you expect. In countries like the United States, it's pretty close to half-half. One of the things that we see, you can ask yourself, to what extent are inequalities driving mobility? And one of the things that we actually see is that most of the inequalities in access to higher education are not driven by tuition. That's what people believe, but there's no evidence for this. But they are driven by inequalities that we see in the school system. When you take our PISA data, for example, the weaker the influence of social background on learning outcomes at school, the more mobile, upward mobile students are. And you can see Finland, great example, Spain, Italy. Those countries are doing really well, whereas countries where education mobility, the impact of social background in the school system on outcomes is very strong, also tend to be the ones where we're not seeing much education mobility and access to higher education later in people's lives. So, in a nutshell, we're not seeing yet the kind of systemic transformation that people talk about. Much of this is still more of the same around the world. Now we're getting to the butterfly from the kind of caterpillar is not yet happening. Now we're talking about more and more variants of this, but in fact, basically, the patterns that we see are still more about quantitative expansion than the kind of paradigm shifts that we really will probably need to see over the coming years to come. And with that, I want to stop my presentation and leave enough time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sliker. We do have about 10 minutes for questions if you're available for that time.
Yes, sure.
Our committee this is our third meeting. We have another year, a little more than a year before we'll be complete. So we're asking ourselves some pretty basic questions, particularly on benchmarking. For example, our previous plan that is closing the gaps, it was adopted in 2000, really benchmarked our population for participation against other states. We're now asking ourselves, as an alternative to that, should we be benchmarking our workforce against other states in the United States and perhaps against other countries? So that's kind of a fundamental question that at least I'd like to start the questioning of you today.
Yeah, I think that is a very important question. One reason why I believe benchmarking Texas against other nations is important is that when you look at the dynamism, the change in expansion of learning, the change in demand, it's actually not happening in the United States, but it's happening in countries, particularly in Asia, but also in some European countries. So I do think the international perspective is very, very important. If you benchmark Texas against other states in the United States, you're probably not going to see much change. But if you compare Texas with some of the high-performing and rapidly improving nations, it's a very different picture.
And benchmarking the workforce, because once again, we previously have, and are today, benchmarking our population in and out of the workforce. But at least in my view, and I think others, is that we need to move to the workforce because workforce really translates into income levels and to quality of life. In a sense, we're all in a competition for some share of world income, and to the extent that education is a differentiator, it would seem, at least to me, that it would be important to benchmark the workforce and not the population. And benchmarking in completions and not in participation.
Absolutely, and I think in most industrialized countries, skills are now by far the most important driver of productivity growth and by implication economic growth. So it's actually a very, very important and quantifiable dimension that you need to look at. Of course, when you look at the entire population, looking at the young and older parts of the workforce tell you very different stories. But I think international benchmarking allow you to look at this with the kind of granularity that you need for this.
Dr. Faulkner?
Yes, I actually have a question, two questions about just informational questions. On your last actual graph, which is the relationship between equity at school and equity in higher education, there is a country covered up by the arrow in the upper left corner of the graph. What's the country?
I'm sorry, I can't see I just have to check the PowerPoint. Go back to this. It's Iceland.
Iceland, okay. Okay, and then I have a question also about your informal education financed in industry is the way I understood it. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to find that graph now. It's, well, you don't have numbers on them. It's called Annual Labor Costs of Employer-Sponsored Non-Formal Education as a Percentage of GDP.
Yes.
Right. Can you tell me what you mean by non-formal education? Let's say in Germany, at these elaborate apprenticeship programs that exist in German industry, is that part of this?
No, actually, we're not talking about formal education. In Germany, industry provides a lot of quite school-based and formal training to people in the context of the dual system of apprenticeship. That's not accounted for here. Here we are basically just looking in the upgrading of skills by employers. As people sort of have completed their education, they get some additional training by the employer. So that's what you can see here on this chart.
But apprenticeship training is not in there.
No, apprenticeship, if you would add it, it would be a lot more money. I mean, in the case of Germany or Austria, enterprises pay about 20% of the total cost of high school. So if you would add this, you would get a gigantic number. This is not covered in this chart.
Okay.
Okay. Looking to our committee for some questions for Dr. Schleicher. Yes. Okay, Shirley?
Question. Thank you. Great presentation and amazing data. On your chart, the private returns on investment post-secondary ed for men and the chart below it, do you have the charts and the data for women? Because certainly in Texas and the USA, we're seeing more and more women as head of households and in the professional markets. And I'm just curious. I'm sure you have that, but I would want to think that USA did much better for females than many of the other countries due to cultural barriers, etc.
Yeah, of course we do have data for women. They are published in Education Advance, and I'm happy to share them with you. The reason why I choose to focus on men here, because for women the higher incidence of part-time work actually is distorting the rates of return. If you look at the rates of return just per employee, they would look a lot lower for women than they look for men. But that's mainly an artifact of, to one extent, the higher incidence of part-time work, and also the course of studies being chosen. So, but we do have all of that information.
Dr. Murdoch.
A question for you. When we do these kind of analysis, one of the big problems is really actually controlling for all the background differences that are there that may lead to the results that you get on test scores or anything of that nature. So, and if you have a country that is smaller, less diverse in terms of the characteristics, it's much less difficult than if you've got a country like the United States, has vast socioeconomic differences and other regional and other differences that affect it. How do you control for those factors? It's a good question. When we do have our school test, we actually measure the socioeconomic composition of populations. So we have good data that we collect on, family background, social background, parental education, and so on. So we can actually take that into account in our analysis. The one caveat I want to make, actually, the United States is more diverse than some other countries, but it's actually not so untypical in terms of socioeconomic diversity. It's more unequal in terms of income, but when you look at other socioeconomic attributes, immigration and so on, it is a pretty typical country now in the industrialized world in terms of diversity. But these data are accounted for simply by looking at the socioeconomic context of individuals. And what are those socioeconomic that you look at other than income?
Yes, we look at, income is one. We look at parental education, education of the father, education of the mother. We look at household attributes. We look at home possessions. We look at access to educational resources. And we look at something we call cultural capital, how many books do people have at home. It's an area of measures that we use to construct this index of social background.
Kathy?
Can I follow up on that question of Dr. Murdoch to see if you also measure language skills and the primary language skills of those students matriculating in that particular country that are not native to the country?
Yes, we do that. We actually have that information too. We basically know whether the students do have speak a language at home that is different from the language of the test in which it's given. And but also here, I must say, the United States is not untypical. You can look to many European countries where the share of non-native language speakers is actually significantly higher than in the case of the United States. But again, it's one of the attributes that is quite easily quantified. What I should say, however, and I think that's a very important point, countries do not differ primarily in the share of disadvantage, but they differ a lot in how they moderate disadvantage. I give you an example. If you look, for example, to highly disadvantaged children in, Singapore or China, or very poor areas, they still outperform children from privileged backgrounds in most Western nations. So what we see is not so much diversity in countries in the social composition of populations, but in the capacity of education systems to mobilize the talent of disadvantaged children. There's a lot of investment in many of those countries going into disadvantage and actually higher expectations placed on them. And that is what explains more than simply looking at the composition of populations.
Okay, we have a good a world expert here in higher education and benchmarking, and the OECD is the leader, and they're the think tank for the world, particularly for the developed world. So this is a real great opportunity to ask what comes to your mind. Yes, that's Bob.
I have a question relative to the cost that the individual student bears in obtaining higher education. I'm still pondering your graph that has the different groups as their tuition fee proportion of students that benefit from public loans and so on. But do you have data that indicates that the relative tuition level, I guess relative to the wealth of the country in here, is a barrier to higher education? Don't know whether I got that across to you, but what I'm really trying to ascertain is...
Well, you know, I think...
What I'm really trying to ascertain is whether or not that as tuition levels keep going up, which is the contribution that the individual makes to their higher education, does that hit a barrier where then all of a sudden you find that the rate and the benefit that the country gets from the higher education goes down?
Yeah, and it's a very relevant question. I mean, first of all, one must say that the level of tuition in the United States is unusually high. There's no other country coming close to that. And, you know, I don't want to sort of put this on record, but, you know, you need to ask yourself the question whether the value students get is still in an appropriate relationship to the level of tuition that is being charged in U.S. institutions. The levels are very high. Still, I would think that is not the primary barrier. The primary barrier is access to financing. I give you an example. If you are, for example, in the United Kingdom or Australia, you also have to pay a high level of tuition. But typically, the government will guarantee a loan to every student, and the loan is only to be repaid contingent on your future income. So it's actually almost risk-free for any student in New Zealand, in Australia, in the UK to go to university, pay a lot of tuition, and they're only going to pay back once they actually have a decent income. So you don't have the kind of debt problem that you do have in the United States. It's the government that guarantees that and takes up the risk and actually makes a good business with this. You know, I think it's actually a very interesting point that particularly in Australia, in the United Kingdom, governments actually make huge amount of money out of this system because those people pay a lot more taxes later on in their lives, and they are the fastest expanding countries on this. So in a nutshell, I think the level of tuition is exceptionally high in the United States, but the bigger problem that I see is more the accessibility and the level of risk students have in accessing funds.
Particularly relative to the amount of debt that they incur and then have to pay off at a later time.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, I think this has been very productive. We have time for one more question. Laura?
Yes. Would you think that perhaps the level of complexity of the varying indicators in the United States make us a little bit more unique? For example, in China, you're looking at maybe poverty, but you're not looking at race or culture or religion or language. In the United States, we have, or immigration for that matter. In the United States, if you're looking at a poor child, we're looking at multiple facets of why that child is more challenging to teach or for him or her to learn.
Yeah, I think these are all issues that I think are highly relevant. Still, I wouldn't underestimate the kind of challenges that you would have in China. I mean, for example, you go to some of the places like Shanghai, these sort of very advanced cities, they get about 500,000 of immigrants coming into the city every year. So there's huge inbound immigration from people from very, very poor provinces. Those children typically have parents with no education whatsoever. So the challenges are different, but I wouldn't underestimate the magnitude of the challenges in this. What's different really is that if you are living in a province like Shanghai, is the significant investment that the province makes in educating those people. So there is no tolerance for failure in the system. Actually, every of these migrant children were going to be put into a school with the same high expectations. Teachers in the schools will go out to talk to parents twice. There is a lot of investment being made in those kinds of differences. I agree with you that the kind of socioeconomic challenges are of a very different nature, but don't underestimate the kind of problems you have in those countries.
Thank you.
Dr. Schleicher, I'd like to thank you for taking your time. I know it's a little later than Paris, past the workday, and thank you very much once again for presenting to the coordinating board in Texas. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wow. Worked. Good.
Worked very well. Yeah. That was very good.
Interesting way that he presented the slides too. Yeah. Got superposing.
We're going to take a short 5-minute break because we're switching now to Georgetown, USA, and Dr. Jeff Stroll. And it'll take us about 5 minutes to make that connection, so everybody has a chance if they want to do a break, but we need to be back here in 5 minutes. Thank you. Dr. Stroll, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Woody Hunt, I'm the chairman of the Strategic Planning Committee for the Higher Education Coordinating Board, the state of Texas, and appreciate your taking your time. I'd like to introduce you briefly to the committee. Dr. Stroll is the Director of Research at the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. He leads the center's research on the supply and demand of education and how education enhances career opportunities for today's workforce. Before joining the center, Dr. Stroll was a senior analyst and project director at the research consulting firm Westat, Inc., where he was involved in program evaluation and analysis of education outcomes. Dr. Stroll earned his MA and PhD in economics from American University. We'd like to welcome you electronically to the state of Texas. And with that, we've got scheduled about 20 minutes for you to present and 20 minutes for us to ask you questions. But effectively what we'll do is whatever time's left after you present, we'll use that for questions, allowing 40 minutes in total. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been told you're a very shy group, so I won't expect any questions at all. But no, let me try to give you all an overview of how I've structured my presentation and why. I have a long history. My dissertation was in international comparisons of education and the impact on economic outcomes. And over the years, being here in Washington, I have grown to be a bit of a skeptic every time I hear about international benchmarking. And I think it's very important that we ask ourselves why it is that we're looking to other countries, and then how it is that we turn that into something that enables us to make changes here in the United States. Because quite frankly, we do have an awful lot to learn. I thought the presentation before was quite informative, but if you might have noticed, it took us nowhere towards making a solution to the many problems that exist. It was one more case of illustrating that we have a problem, and I think this is an extremely important thing for us to consider. What do we do with the information? So hence the title of my presentation, International Benchmarking for What? Why are we doing this? And so I'm now going to, someone here is going to help me, so I'm now turning to what is slide 2. And I asked, why should we care about international benchmarking? All too often, it's just another hit in the media of we were number one and now we're not. As our director here likes to say, if we are so dumb, why are we so rich? So we really need to put this into context of how we absorb this information and the full cumulative effects of the American economic and educational structure and how it leads to the economic outcomes that we have here in the country. So I'm now turning to slide 3. On the other hand, not to be a skeptic, we do have to face that we need to keep up with upskilling in the United States. By this, I mean the upward ratcheting need for more post-secondary education among our workforce. Otherwise, we're going to see the American dream undermined. And for me, the American dream is characterized by education as the great equalizer. Today, we see that only 3 in 10 jobs to a high school graduate result in what we call family sustaining earnings, $35,000 or more. And these jobs are solely for men. And this will, the opportunities for high school graduates is continuing to decline. From 1970 to today, we have seen that households headed by high school graduates have plummeted in their share of being in the middle class. So the high school economy of our parents and grandparents has disappeared or is disappearing and is quickly becoming a post-secondary economy. So the leverage point of your actions, of asking the questions that you're asking, of improving the education for the citizens of the state of Texas as a link to giving them a better life is right on target. I think data across the board supports this. So I'm now going to turn to slide 4. I always like to put a detail about what we mean by upskilling. Auto mechanics is a great example. In 1968, 58% of all mechanics were high school dropouts. By 2007, that's a pooled sample, 19% were high school dropouts. And we had moved from 6% with associate's degree to 30% with associate's degree. And I think you can see this. If you recall back, I see a few gentlemen here who are a little older, sort of like myself, and used to fix your own car. You don't do that anymore. And so the skill set among mechanics has ratcheted up to need computer skills. And this activity has happened across all the occupations in the U.S. economy. Of course, some have gone down in their educational requirements. But in general, 2/3 of the increased demand for education in the U.S. economy has come as a result of upskilling, new requirements inside of jobs, not the idea that we're creating new jobs, but we are demanding more requirements. I'm now going to change to slide 5. In my mind, worrying about our rankings does nothing for change in the United States other than perhaps motivating us to do something about it. We often hear, and I say chapter 2 of this conversation often becomes, well, let's be Germany. Let's just try to adopt this thing, find the magic sauce that some other country does to make the U.S. better. Well, in my mind and in my research, I really believe we can't transplant European models to the United States. We need to look at them, yes, but we need to adopt, adapt, and innovate. This is the American approach that has led us successfully through the last century of some fairly substantial economic growth and the creation of wealth, especially in the post-war era. I'm now going to move to slide 6. Things are just done differently in Europe. We need to think about this. The success of the European model has many numerous variations. It's not a big monolith. Europe has a lot of variation and differences. But it's based on a corporatist governance structure where unions, employers, and governments sit equally at the table, and that you have some remnants of central planning left over from the post-war period and what was called manpower planning, where they actually look forward at goals about where the economy is going. It's something we don't do here in the United States. We really try to let free market forces guide the enrollment decision-making of our students to help that align with the labor market. And you'll see throughout the remainder of the presentation, we believe we're at the cusp where we can start to improve and advance this. And actually, Texas is pretty much at the forefront of doing some stuff in this area of trying to use labor market information to backfeed to the education system to help us get much better alignment and much better workforce preparation from the higher education system. So I think this is something we need to think about. We're doing good things. I'm now going to move to slide 7. The U.S. model, pardon me, the U.S. model is one that has been built on flexibility and free markets. We get our flexibility through a mix of general and specific education. The average lifetime job holdings in the United States is between 9 and 11 jobs. The stereotypical European worker will have less than 3, more commonly close to 2. As I was telling Dr. Smith that my wife is Italian, and we go back to Italy every year, and every single one of her high school cohort has the same job that they had when they left high school. In one sense, it's very good. You have a lot of employment stability, but it also is reinforced by high levels of long-term unemployment and the inability of people to move between jobs. The ability to think on the job and learn new tasks is part of the thing that enables overall macroeconomic flexibility of the U.S. economy. Lets us roll with the punches in ways that other economies can't. It comes with costs. The European model, on the other hand, creates very tight articulation between education and work. We have tracking going back to the 8th grade. The example of my wife, she started training to be a librarian in the 8th grade. And so these things, it's a much different system. Their high school goes into the 2 years of our post-secondary. So the systems are different. So when you saw those data points on high school, their high school and our high school is a different creature in the amount of time and focused study that they have. So there's a difference in systems. Our U.S. model is a rejection of tracking. And this is kind of, in some ways, regretfully, the demise of CTE in the United States has been the stigma of tracking. I personally believe we need to rethink that and find ways to help many of our students through those pathways. Texas does do a lot of very good work in this area. We can talk about that in a little bit. I'm now going to move to slide 8. Both models work. The American model works by having a flexible workforce that's built on this specific and general needs. We do our job matching in the labor market, and we add keep current by doing workplace training. We also use a lot of industry-specific certifications, have these short periods of training to help people keep up with the times. The European model, again, works with tracking. Student pathways that are decided much earlier. And as was pointed out with the stereotypical German model, education and the workplace come very tightly together. Students are working half the day at the plant, half the day in school. By the time they graduate, they already have an employer. They already are an employee of the firm that they were apprenticing with, and they commonly have one job across a life cycle. And it works very well when the government is there to help act as a shock absorber. Again, we choose not to do these more planned models. We're going to let the free market help us move. I'm now going to move to slide 9. This all being said, back to international benchmarking, we cannot hide from the diminishing educational outcomes that are happening in the United States. Work that I've been doing recently, looking at different models of affirmative action, have demonstrated to me that our secondary system is not producing enough college qualified students, especially from families from the bottom half of income or from underserved minority groups, to fill the seats of our top universities in a way that would be parallel the same distribution among the population. So there's a lot of problems in K-12 that need to be resolved, and so there's the solutions to these problems are very multifaceted. It's not one. There's going to be no one single answer that's going to help us make the improvements. We have to work together on the articulation between these systems. I'm now going to move to slide 10. But also, we cannot be blind to the lost talent that is happening in the U.S. system. Every year, 580,000 students from the top half of the nation's high schools do not complete college within 8 years. This is bigger than a bread box. Right. So while we're worrying about what we're not doing, we're wasting what we do. And there's a growing consciousness about this across the country. But it is something for us to be think about. It comes down to issues of resource allocation. It has things someone was mentioning earlier, all of the background issues, language, first generational status. A lot of that leads to what we call expectational formation. So you might have a highly qualified low-income student whose parents never went to college. There's no one there to tell them that they have the talent to go to UT Austin or to go to a highly selective institution outside of the state. And so there's a lot of work going on trying to help us find these students and help them bring it in. And so this is just something to consider. It's another aspect of the problem. So now I'll move to slide 11. Well, what can we do? This really becomes, okay, international benchmarking. It tells us we got a problem. Okay, so what do we do now? In the United States, as I've said before, we've chosen to use market forces to help us find efficient solutions. When we start thinking about education supply and demand as a market, we need to also think that it too will benefit by improved transparency and improved use of information. In the United States, Texas is part of this in what we call administrative data systems, state longitudinal data systems movements, where we're linking wage record data with student transcript data that really is helping us figure out what is happening to the graduates in your state, looking at programs. And this information, the first stage we're seeing nationally is to use this as counseling information. Tell students, well, you know, if you're going to get a degree in French literature, you might become a better citizen, but your earnings will be X, Y, or Z. And we're hoping that this type of informational transmission will act as a counseling apparatus to help align the demands of the labor market with the enrollment decision-making of the students. Ultimately, as these systems develop, we hope that we'll be able to take information from the labor market and bring it back to the education system to help keep curriculum development updated. And the last little mark I have at the bottom here, it says Texas DWA. Some of the most cutting-edge work in this area done with Mark Anderberg, who was with the Detailed Work Activities Institute in Texas, really gets down in the ground and investigates occupational skill sets and brings that back into the education system. And models like this are really cutting edge. They're much easier when we're looking at highly specific technical education, a little more difficult as we get into general education, but it's something to think about. We need to, how do we improve? Well, this idea of linking with the workforce is going to help us because students go to school to get jobs. They're not here. I mean, yes, there is a bit of consumption good, but they go to get jobs there, and we're here to give them jobs. So in this alignment with labor market, evidence suggests that contextual learning is one way to help improve outcomes over traditional remedial education, which tends to be send somebody back to high school, as opposed to teaching math in context. I personally failed out of college my first go. I went and became a carpenter, and I learned my math as a carpenter. You do trigonometry, you do geometry, you do algebra, and I came back, and here I am now. And so using labor market information to help us with these program fields of study to get people college ready. Let's teach them math for what they're doing. So teach math for a radiologist. Don't send them back to high school. This idea of counseling students leads to improved persistence and completion, and also keeping updated with skill sets is another aspect of alignment with education that we really should be thinking about. So as we improve K-12 skill sets, we also need to be thinking about improving K-12 skill sets as they align with workforce, as we think about using education to leverage global and national competition, economic competition, and competitiveness. I am now going to move to slide 12. Alignment is really key, at least in looking at the workforce. I think one slide to me that the gentleman pointed out was the fact of how little mismatch we actually have when you look at skill sets versus education in the U.S. economy. And a lot of the way we do job matching in the labor market, I think, does. If people hit the labor market, they bounce around, and then they find the job that meets the combination of their general and specific skill sets. We do know that in the sub-baccalaureate sphere, especially working in field is extremely important. Someone with a certificate, a 1 or a 2-year sub-baccalaureate degree, is going to earn 37% more if they work in field than if they don't. And so this idea of aligning what students are doing with the workforce needs is extremely important, both for the economy. We know that 37% is not only their individual earnings, but is a marker of their enhanced productivity. So they're adding more to the state economy and to the individual employer, and getting the gains in their own wage benefits. So we need to really think about this. And again, looking backward at the wage record transcript data system, and we hope someday that occupation will come onto these data, because I think that's extremely important. I can go more into detail about that later. I'm now going to move to slide 13, where I will close and open for questions. Here we have a picture of the U.S. human capital development apparatus, as I call it. We find that we do more training and development in the workforce than we do in the formal sector. So we get people ready for work, but we put them out into the workplace where they do an awful lot of learning. Some of this is self-paid, where employees go out and do the time and money to get an industry-specific certification to keep their skill set up. We have the employer providing substantial amounts of money in on-the-job training, both formal and informal. And there's an interaction between these sets of study. We know that the employers partner with local community colleges and the higher education institutions to talk about what type of curriculum is going to help meet their needs. So this picture, while the pies is separated here, there's really, in the United States, an awful lot of interaction between these. So we're sending people back and forth between the workplace and the education system, and there's a lot of communication between these sectors that's certainly not picked up in here. So to close, I think we need to think, the United States has been faced over time with many boogeymen. Detroit in the 70s, Japanese cars, China now. And we've survived many of these things because of the grit and resolve of the American model. So when we look to these targets in benchmarking, we can't hide from them. We should never hide from them. But we should just say, okay, now what are we going to do about it? And the information that we see in the general benchmarking discussion doesn't provide us those answers. And I wish it did. It doesn't. We, again, believe that the more we can do to make alignments and communications between the workplace and the education system is one key to improving our education outcomes and the economic benefit for the citizens of the country and, of course, for the state of Texas. So anyways, thank you, and I'm look forward to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stroll. This committee is charged with creating and advising the coordinating board on a new strategic higher education plan for the state of Texas. The current plan on a benchmarks higher education participation against 10 peer states. It does not benchmark completions. It does not benchmark attainment within the workforce. So the questions that we're asking ourselves now is it now appropriate to move toward a benchmarking that links workforce completion or higher education attainment against other states or other countries? So that's one question. And the other part is using research that has been done within your office there, do we adopt a numerical number, let's call it 60%, and if we do, is that the whole workforce, or is it the younger, the 25 to 34-year-old? So we're very early in this process, and we're really at this point of what role does benchmarking play, and if it plays a role, what's the appropriate metrics that we should be looking to adopt as a part of our beginning of this process?
I think those are very good questions. We Center on Education in the Workforce, of course, will say bring workforce into those metrics. I think it's extremely important to understand how you are succeeding in providing for the livelihood of your citizens via education. I think it's an extremely important metric to bring onto the table. So, yes, I would be doing that. I'd be a little careful about how you think about it. Currently, the state of play nationally has been with one-year earnings, and I think that's not necessarily the best measure. We're evolving to using longitudinal analysis, like where's somebody at 1 year, 5 year, 10 year. And so I think that's very important. One piece that is missing is the use of occupation. Industry is where you work. Occupation is what you do. So if we want to think about how to evaluate labor market outcomes relative to education, we need to be thinking in terms of occupation. Industry is good, but occupation would be better. And there is a movement abreast nationally to try to bring that data in to help. I wouldn't let it stop us that it's not there. I would be thinking also other metrics that I would be using here are employment stability, employment gains when someone makes a wage change, or when they make an employer change. I think those are important things to consider, and not just point-in-time earnings. Variation in earnings, of course, are very important. On benchmarking, this is to other states, nationally, whatever. I would benchmark if it leads you to ideas about how to make improvements. So you have, 10 states that I'm guessing you feel look enough like Texas that a benchmark is going to be a valuable contribution, right? But I think I would sit back and say, okay, what's the difference in the funding model? What's the differences in the alignment with industry in those states? Things like that, to ensure that you're doing as close to an apples-to-apples comparison, and B, that you're able to look at those data in ways that give you actionable levers. What do they tell you something to do, right? So let's just say, I'm not sure what one of your benchmarking states, but let's just say Oklahoma, nearby state. So now Oklahoma is 2% better in completions than you are. What do you do with the information? That's the question that I would ask if I was in your seat. So that would be one thing. I benchmark your progression also. So I would say here is where we are. We're going to implement a policy change. Let's use the data that Texas has, which is these wage record and administrative data. Are we successful? Is the new curriculum successful? Is the new funding model in the technical system in Texas, is it working? Do we think that industry-specific certifications add value? So that would be one thing. On your second question on targeting, I have advised the governor's office of Utah and Tennessee on this issue as they've set goals. I think it's helpful because they're aspirational to help move you from point A to point B. The downside of doing it is to fall into the trap of, if you build it, they will come. Let's just say overnight you had a helicopter drop of 15 million PhDs. Would the economy actually be able to support the job? So in doing the educational goal targeting, I think you need to dance very tightly with economic development. So if you're looking at doing new, say, tax incentives to bring in auto manufacturers into the state, well, then you need to parallel, your educational targeting most likely was sub-baccalaureate CAD CAM design in the auto mechanics field. You got to be really specific about the alignments that you do, and broad targeting. Well, Texas, I think, is the drive to 55, so they want to get 55%. Let's just say they're one of your target states in your benchmarking. Is it going to be good for you to do drive to 57 just to be better than Tennessee, or is it going to be good for you to do 95% working in field of the graduates from our programs? You see what I mean? It's sort of, how do you use the information is what I would be thinking about. So yes, goal setting is a specific number is great. It lights a fire under your tail in a sense of trying to get there, but marry it with economic development. That would be my personal suggestion.
Yeah, I'd like to open it up for committee questions. Bernie?
Thank you, Woody, and thank you, Dr. Stroll, for a very down-to-earth, interesting presentation. In my opinion, the NBA, the NFL do a much better job of recruiting than employers do. And I'm just wondering if we should build some connective tissue between the employers and let's say 10th graders on the recruiting side, so that they can have input into the academic direction that the student takes in preparation for their job.
Well, that is a great question. I am a great supporter of career and technical education. The idea that you want to have some employer voice into education and the development of curriculum. In the United States, we have rejected tracking. So we need to figure out how to balance your suggestion with putting people on dead-end roads. So yes, I think that we should have 10th graders begin to be thinking about work. I think that we should have programs that begin preparing them for work. And there's a lot of stuff in the career pathway, job cluster world where you're not necessarily limiting people's choice sets, right? You still enable them with enough mobility to change directions. We really don't want someone to become a widget A manufacturer and then all of a sudden the economy only wants widget Bs, right? So we want to enable the students to have a lot of ability to move with the economy. So getting back there and counseling students that they should start thinking about work is really going to help them graduate. I feel strongly about that, right? If they keep their eyes on the prize, intentionality to get done, we can't afford students wandering in the education system. So that would we're just careful that I just want to be careful and cognizant of the tracking problem. That's all, because we need that employer who goes back into the 10th grade to have a strong commitment to employing that student if they get on that correct track. That's how the German model works, right? The German model works because the employer is very committed to eventually hiring that student if they work out. So we need to figure out balance with that in the U.S. I'm not sure if we know it yet.
I call it voluntary channeling as opposed to the European model, which is government channeling. I agree. No, I agree with you. I'm very much in agreement with you. It's just that there's a public perception, I believe, nationally, that if you do that, you're tracking, and I think we need to fight that stereotypical version. I do agree with you that if we go back to 10th grade counsel the students, we would be giving them good information and it'll help make the markets work better.
Raymond?
So.
Dr. Stroll, I want to ask you about what seems to be a contradiction in your PowerPoint presentation. You note that American workers typically have 9 to 11 jobs during their careers, and later you've indicated you're a strong supporter of contextualized education. which one of those 9 to 11 jobs do you contextualize for?
Very good question. Inside the U.S. economy there and other economies, of course, there's a concept of occupational transferability. And so people begin to fall as they move through those 7 to 11 jobs into generalized areas. So we have, I'm going to make some numbers up, but there's no data behind them, but I'm going to guess maybe 3, 4 of the jobs that people have in a life cycle would be considered to be transition jobs. You know, leave college, go teach for America, work in college, have a waitress job, things like that. Once you hit the labor market, might dance between a couple of employers until you kind of latch down on what you're doing. And commonly, but not always, the person's going to start to fall on a job that has hopefully some relationship to the core of their education. So the contextual learning issue generally comes up in that sub-baccalaureate technical education field. And so the targets that they would contextualize for would be the job cluster that their pathway leads them into. So we're going to have mechanics as a general field, right? So as that narrows down to the job, let's say then you become a BW mechanic, the contextual education would be general mechanics, not Volkswagen mechanics. Does that help?
Yes, except, of course, and you know what the next response is, that contextualizing learning at such an early stage also means that you're putting people on a pathway, but it's not necessarily tracking for the reasons that Bernie just pointed out, but you're putting people on a pathway at that point in their lives when their decision making is least likely to predict what they're going to do in the future.
No, I agree with that. Very, very good point. I should have been more clear. When I talk about the use of contextualized education, I'm talking about people whose other alternative is failing college, is what we see with remedial education. When you send somebody back to high school to go relearn Algebra 2, they generally don't complete college. So I'm not talking about doing this at an early stage. I'm talking about doing it at a known loss point and trying to help people whose, in the main, their other alternative is failing college. So it's not necessarily the best solution for everybody. It's one of the pieces of a solution that I think will help us with our completions problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Sure.
I want to go back a little bit to benchmarking. What do we gain or lose by being better or worse than another state or another country, A, and B, if you were going to benchmark, what are the most important things that you would benchmark with other states or other countries?
The loss, I think, of benchmark is what my boss calls target fixation, becoming so overly concerned only with the target that you do nothing with the information. It's a thing that comes out of jet fighters. The pilots used to come zooming in on a test target and forget about the rest of the landscape and run into the ground. We don't want to do that. We want to look at the benchmark, help it move us somewhere, but decide beforehand where we want to move to. So I think that is one of the first pieces. And what was the second part of your question? I apologize.
Well, I wondered if you were actually benchmarking, what would you benchmark against? What would be the elements of the benchmark?
Well, I would start off with probably a multi-tiered set of benchmarking targets, understanding that our system, education to the workplace, has many off-ramps. So looking at first high school completion, high school dropout, we're just adding to poverty and people in need of social services. So get to high school. So what do we do after high school? If they enter into the workforce, the benchmark should be level of employment, employability, and progression in some type of career pathway. And then I would apply that to each level as I moved up the educational tier. So as we produce a graduate, what happens to them? Do they reach some level? There's a lot of talk about gainful employment in a regulatory sense. I think the gainful employment idea is something we should think about. Someone's paying for college. It should be paying for the cost, and it should be generating them at least the opportunity to enter the middle class. That, to me, is the promise that we've given the citizens of this country. Persist and succeed in education, and you'll persist and succeed in the labor market. So we should use that as the metric by which we benchmark against the national average, the benchmark states, and we have to be a little bit careful about looking at other countries because the labor market institutions are just so much different. They're hard to hire, hard to fire. When you get a job, you just don't get fired. We don't have that system, so I'd be a little careful with international benchmarking on employment stability. So I would stick with that with like-minded, free market state economies, things like that, in that particular comparison.
Ms. Cathy, we're getting near the end of our questions.
Dr. Stroll, is there a happy spot for industry on the amount of training that is provided, either on site or paid for and sponsored by industry? I mean, I have a concern that where we're heading in the United States it's a greater emphasis not on our educational institutions but on the employers.
Wow. I think that's a great question. Is there a happy spot on this one? That's tough. I saw the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce did recently a survey of the top 500 employers in the state of Pennsylvania, and they found that the states that had the least problems with finding skilled workers or long-term skills issues, the ones that had the least problems were those that maintained internal training apparatus. So it seems in those cases that it's how well does education and the workplace dance together. I don't think it should be like one side or the other. That the industry partners need to help provide information back into the education system to help the education system do a better job about what it's doing. And the education system needs to be cognizant that the industry partners generally speak about the current labor market conditions, but they don't necessarily use information about what the labor market's going to look like tomorrow. And so the state and the nation uses a lot of occupational projections data. I'd bring that into the mix a bit so that the education system takes a forward-looking view. Where does the state economy look like it's going? The industry partners are generally, and I'm not very experienced in this area, so I don't want to misspeak, but generally are advising on today's needs and not necessarily projecting forward. So we need to balance our responsibility to the citizen students about what the economy is going to look like and present information about what employment looks like today.
Let me ask you one last question, and that is, if we do benchmark against the workforce in terms of higher education attainment, what would be your opinion on Texas focusing on the 25 to 34-year-olds that is our least educated. We're different than almost everywhere else. Our least educated part of the workforce is that first decade between 25 and 34-year-old. It's also, if we're looking to do a 15-year plan, that's the piece that we can hopefully have the greatest impact on. So should we have a singular focus? Adult basic education is not unimportant, but as a state, is that a more reasonable goal?
That's pretty tough. The problem with this is you start when you're 25 to 30, but you don't feel the results until you're 40. So there's a lot of trajectory issues going on. I would answer this question in conjunction with your workforce agencies and look what actually happens in Texas. So what does the wage of a 25 to 35-year-old mean about where they're going to be when they're 50? And look at that by various industries and help that let you answer the question. Because yes, 25 to 35, great launch point. But how much does it tell us about what's happening? David Stevens of the Jacob France Institute at the University of Baltimore has done a paper that looked at some of this that could be replicated for Texas and would help you answer that question for yourself. Because I'm really saying you need to know, if you look at 25 to 35, does it tell you enough good information, given all the transitory jobs that that age group has, about where they end up when they're 40? And I don't have the answer for Texas there, but I can help you get the information. So we'll follow up with an email, and I'll get this paper to you, and we can certainly talk about that particular issue in more detail.
Right. Thank you. Shirley, one last question. And
just very quickly, Dr. Stroll, are there, through your research and field experience, have you found some best practices, some exemplary models that this committee might need to investigate or look at to help us with what our task is? Who's doing it better than we are?
I think that I've heard several questions or several facets of what your task is. If you would follow up with a detailed email about each one of those tasks, I think I could have some suggestions. For instance, on the setting an educational production target. I'd have you talk with the governor's office in Utah and Tennessee and understand how they're doing it and what they're doing to partner with economic development. When it comes to benchmarking, I actually don't know of any other state that has come to me to talk about the use of benchmarking. On the alignment with labor market, I think that there's a lot going on, and I can certainly help you. And then I think within your own state, the things happening with the Detailed Work Activities Institute and some things in the technical college systems are good exemplars of how to bring industry partners into the game, especially in the sub-baccalaureate sphere. It's not as applicable in the four-year sector and the graduate sector, but it's something to think about and just, to look at. How would you adopt it to a four-year model, things like that.
Okay. Dr. Stroll, thank you very much. We appreciate your time today.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
Right, thank you. Committee members, we're running a little bit behind schedule. I want to call your attention to our discussion groups. Coordinating board staff members have set up 3 small group discussion areas in this boardroom. So if you could retrieve your lunch and find your table, we'll meet separately in these groups to discuss and reach consensus on recommended answers to the questions regarding our benchmark goal for 2030 and whether we recommend including the goal of workforce success in the next long-term higher education plan for Texas. So we've got 2 questions. We're going to meet over lunch, and hopefully, although we're starting a little late, I'm hoping we can get back here at 1 o'clock so that we can stay on a 2 o'clock schedule for adjournment. Thank you. I'd like to have our 3 groups present in order. So group 1, I don't know who's going to present for group 1. Does group 1 have a spokesperson, or is the? Oh, yeah. I'm actually elected first. Oh, okay, Mary. Very good.
Sorry.
Okay, the question is whether or not 60% of the Texas population's achievement of post-secondary educational training is a reasonable benchmark for 2030, or whether there should be different levels. And the group that I was facilitating that elected me as their spokesperson, one of the big conversations that group had, group number one, was that we're not hearing too much about the counseling at the career counseling and how important career counseling can be with respect to motivating students. So that's an issue that our group wanted to bring out, was the importance of career counseling to motivate students and to make sure that they're understanding what their decisions are and the consequences of those decisions. The big conversation that our group had was that there is a segment of the population that doesn't really need education beyond high school, even though these jobs will be less in the future. Manual labor is shrinking, but nevertheless, those jobs do exist. So that was part of the conversation about whether or not the 60% was a reasonable benchmark, and whether or not that could be workable, just simply because another big portion of the population wouldn't necessarily have to have higher education. But in terms of the actual language of the question, our group really wanted to put in the words workforce age population, not just workforce, but really workforce age population, because that would be a very important thing. The other thing that they talked about a lot was that definitions needed to be a part of the plan, because a lot of the conversation was with respect to the measurability of the different types of credentials. They did agree that levels could conceivably be important, because not necessarily everybody needs to be graduated beyond high school at the baccalaureate level. So potentially what that would entail. So levels were an important part of the discussion, as was measurability. Then, let's see, upskilling was a big part of our conversation, and the fact that one size does not necessarily fit all. Okay. And the importance of actually projecting what the workforce needs are going to be in 2030, not necessarily what they are now, but what the workforce needs will be in 2030 or whatever the date of the plan is. So that was pretty much the conversation. A lot of talk about the importance of definition, so I'll end with that. And then the next one is number two question, is whether or not the group recommended that we include the goal of workforce success in the next long-term plan for higher education. And there was a lot of discussion about the success goal in the current higher education plan, closing the gaps by 2015. There was a certain amount of assumption with respect to that plan that educational success in terms of graduation would also lead to workforce success. But when we talked about it, it became quite obvious that it's not as simple a question as you would sort of assume, because you'd sort of think, well, yes, let's include it. Accepting that, what is workforce success, and how do we correlate higher education with that success, given that not all workforce success requires post-secondary education? So it's a little bit more complicated than what you would originally think. So the idea that our group came up with, the importance of measuring what workforce success really means and how higher education can contribute to what that means. So that was pretty much it's less simple than it seems, just to include the goal of workforce success. So that was pretty much our conversation. And if any of the members would like to contribute more that I might have missed, please do so. Sure.
The 60% so much because we got an actual figure that currently today we're at 34 to 35% in accomplishing that goal.
And thank you for bringing that up. That was an issue also, because whether or not that goal potentially is realistic with respect to where we are now, between 32 to 34% of the workforce population is credentialed beyond high school.
On top of that, Given in mind that population will include a lot of first-generation Americans who may have a different culture mindset as to the importance of post-secondary education.
Okay.
Hey, thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Okay, Group 2.
I think I'm speaking for Group 2, Mr. Chairman. I'm getting my reminder here. Actually, the first question, as you all know, is 60% of the population's achievement post-secondary educational training a reasonable benchmark for 2030, or should there be levels? We spent a lot of time on this question in various ways, and spent a lot of time talking. I think in general we agreed that there needs to be some sort of benchmark sort of like this. We talked about the 25 to 34-year-old age group as a marker. If we were to try to look at what fraction is attained, the population attains some sort of credential going over the whole working age population, we don't have enough years to affect most of that. So I think in the interest of recognizing we're dealing with a 15-year horizon here, 25 to 34 seems pretty good. 60%, we had a lot of discussion about whether that's realistic. I mean, even if we were to ramp up and design, install, and ramp up programs of improvement by the time we got half or two-thirds of the way through the 15 years, there would be limits to what it would be possible for us to achieve for that whole 25 to 34-year-old age group. So there's that to worry about. We also talked about the fact that the 25 to 34-year-old age group is, of course, a big span, and as an annual change, even if we were on the right track, we're hardly going to see effects year to year. So is that a good management tool? It might be a good end goal kind of marker for us, but what would we use as a monitoring tool as we were going through the next 15 years? So all of that was in this, and I think our group really didn't reach a conclusion as to what would be a good number or how it would exactly be formulated, but did agree that something like this should be in the picture. We talked about earlier age performance as a monitoring goal. 19 to 24-year-olds, what are they doing as they're going through? Are we gaining any ground there in the fraction of them that are carrying certifications of any kind? We went on to the second question and gave up. The second question had, as you'll know, turned on workforce success. The language is, does your group recommend that we include the goal of workforce success in the next long-term higher education plan for Texas? And actually, I mean, our group was sympathetic to the concept, but wondered what workforce success meant. How are we going to measure that? How are we going to gauge that? And then we got back to, is that question any different from the first question? Is it the same question? We did spend time talking about the fact that one of the big issues that relates workforce success in higher education is credentialing. It's very clear from data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that some college, no degree, doesn't give earning power, not much, to students, that reaching a credential is a big issue, and that whatever we set as goals needs to put a big emphasis on a credential. We need to be measuring the production of credentials. Our group didn't put a lot of distinction between credentials of among different types. we felt we should count certificates and we should count associate's degrees and we should count bachelor's degrees and so forth, but not make it just one of those. And then we had a wonderful story from Dee Margot about the Philadelphia Eagles and their employment practices, and he's going to make sure that we all see it.
All right.
And is there anyone who wants to add anything? I don't know if Dee wants to tell his story.
Oh, tell us.
Yeah, you could go online. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about how the Philadelphia Eagles select their draftees. And it's predicated on their general manager a few years ago, who studied over several years the top 4 final teams in the NFL playoffs and how many of their players had college degrees. And they determined that the last 4 teams always had more college degrees than did the others. And it was a very interesting article, and they talked about how the Eagles, when they interview potential draftees, quiz them on their studies, what they liked, how they learn, their teachers, what they could recall. It's a great little article. I sent it to Kathy. You can go online to Wall Street. It was yesterday's Wall Street. It's still being posted. But it was kind of very interesting that they were looking, they liked it from a commitment standpoint, which meant you were completing your tasks, and the fact that intellectually the offenses they run are such that it requires a higher level of intellect than normally would be elsewhere. And I sent it off to the UTEP athletic director and their president. I sent it to the superintendent of EPISD and said, you need to send this to all your coaches. I mean, it was just, I thought it was a very good, and I doubt very many of you here even saw that. Some of us read the Wall Street from the back forward, but anyway, but that it's really worth, Raymond. I mean, I would say y'all ought to log on and get it. And the interview was with they had an interview with a player that they had selected, a defensive tackle from the University of Wisconsin, who was an academic All-American. And they talked about how they determined it, and the questions they asked, which unlike other NFL teams tend to be cursory or perfunctory about their degrees and their academics, they really delved into that and that it meant. And then they cited the teams that have the highest number of college degree players. The Broncos were one, and I can't remember the others, but and it showed on their win-loss record. So I thought it was kind of an incentive for some groups.
Is that why they were passing on Manziel?
Mr. Chairman, this is a public meeting.
It did point out that even in the basketball, the one and done maybe doesn't carry forward. So we'll see.
Okay, let's move on. Group 3.
Hello, I'm Ginger Gossman. I'm the Director of Planning here, and I facilitated, that may not be the right word, I listened to the conversation of Group 3, and we had very similar themes emerge that the other 2 groups did, which is that we didn't really reach a consensus on the 60%. We do understand that some sort of metric is important, or rather the group really felt like something statewide is important, but maybe it needs to be more nuanced. For example, creating goals set by SES, socioeconomic status, something for disadvantaged students, a different goal than those who come in entire ed advantaged, or maybe looking at different age groups to see how those groups perform, since we're talking about relating this to the workforce. We also talked about connecting this to the K-12 pipeline in a way that is both measurable and practical. So creating a goal statewide for students who are college ready. Maybe that's a way for us to look at how students perform in college without the weight of students who need developmental education being part of that goal. Those students have needs that we absolutely want to address, but perhaps they should have a different goal statewide. We also talked about is there possibly a way that we could look at a crude measure of previous data that might inform any goal we might create now, because we're talking about workforce population, which is a different population than what we were looking at in closing the gaps. Maybe there's some way we can look at the progress Texas has made since 2000 with the workforce population. I don't know if that's really, I know we can do something like a proxy, but I don't know, it wouldn't be exactly it wouldn't fit the goal that we're moving forward, but we could probably come up with something. We spent most of our time on question 1, but question 2, ultimately the answer was yes. We do think that that's important to connect to workforce success. We also did not really know what workforce success meant, which was a great conversation because we got to talk about what it might mean. And it might mean job persistence. It might mean matching a credential to the job market, or rather matching credential to job. And is that a good fit? What we do know is that it has to be measurable, and it has to be measurable over time. So while the answer is yes, it opened the door to an exciting conversation about what that might mean. And I'd like to invite others to contribute.
Thank you, Ginger. I was a part of that committee, so I think we didn't have a consensus within the committee or even within our experts today on the value of international benchmarking. Steve Murdoch has a strong opinion there that we wouldn't add value. I think Dr. Our OECD director had a different opinion that there would be value. We might need some more technical discussion around that on whether international benchmarking. It come down to benchmarking against other states, maybe against Canada and Mexico, and also whether a numerical number was appropriate or whether a relative comparison of competitiveness that would kind of adjust over time. And so we would be not targeting an absolute number, but we'd be targeting a relative competitive number against those that we compete with. I think the elephant in the room, at least as I've looked at this question for a long time, is we're essentially an economic and political unit in the state of Texas. We're competing for our share of world income. We've got some resources in the terms of natural resources that are a big assist. We've got a very competitive business climate that is recruiting a lot of skilled individuals with higher education attainment. But once again, the elephant that's in the room is the composition of our population. Our Anglo population today and the workforce 25 to 64, 44.5% of those have some type of higher education attainment. Our minority, our African American and Hispanic population that are within that same age category is 20.1%. So we've got a 24.4%, or another way to look at it is that that minority population has higher education attainment at a rate of about 45%. Of the Anglo population. And when you go look at the pipeline data put out by Houston Endowment with assistance from the coordinating board, pipeline is at about 40%. So that would tell you we're not making a lot of progress in the terms that our African American Hispanic population, as a percentage of the Anglo population, graduating after 6 years, having some type of higher education attainment after 6 years of graduation from high school. This is very recent data. Is about 40%. So. And then when you look at the population growth, the Anglo population in this state is declining in every age category except over 65 out of the workforce. The African American population, half of its growth is over 65, and it's actually not growing in the birth to 24. So all the population growth in those education years in the Hispanic population, and we've got this huge gap of 45%. So one population group is effectively replacing the other, and the outcome is, unless there's an intervention in policy or funding or both, that's going to change those outcomes and truly narrow the gap, we are going to have a less educated workforce. It already shows up in the 25 to 34 population as being the least educated in the state. We're flat over a 40-year time period, and we're actually down in this last 10-year time period. So we've already hit what I'd call the tipping point to where not only in a relative sense are we losing ground, which we've been doing for a long time, but in absolute sense, we're becoming less educated. And so I think part of our dialogue here is to decide, is this an incremental situation that we can improve incrementally, or are we in a more precarious situation that where more radical intervention is going to be necessary, or we're going to have to accept our fate, which is less educated workforce that can do less complicated jobs that pay less because they're less complicated, which leads to lower incomes, less resources to solve our problems. So kind of a negative circle. So essentially that's where we are. I think that's the bigger picture that I see that we at least ought to keep in consideration as we answer some of these questions. Yes, Raymond.
Woody, this gets back to the point I was making earlier when we got on the call with the OECD guy. I think you've identified the most significant challenge that we face very exactly. We have to do a much better job of providing some form of post-secondary education to a much larger percentage of the poor youngsters in the state. And this article that I distributed to all of you gets at that issue very precisely. And it seems to me the place to begin is we've got to do a better job of graduating first-generation students, poor students, students of color that we get into our colleges and universities at much higher rates than we currently do. And what this article demonstrates is that we can do it. It takes a readjustment, it takes a reinvestment of resources, it takes a redirection of resources, but we can do it. The thing that struck me, the biggest flaw about this article, it seemed to me, is that it suggests that we figured out how to help poor kids succeed in college only very recently. That's not true. It's only become very recent that we've worried about this issue a lot. But we've known how to do it for a very long time. And I think that I would hope that there will be a substantial portion of this committee's ultimate report or ultimate plan. We've got to focus on low-income kids, making sure that they get into college and making sure that they complete some form of credential. The numbers that are in this article, and these are accurate national data, are appalling.
And I think when you use the term economic disadvantage, which I agree is more appropriate, which is essentially filtering out the more affluent Hispanics and African Americans and including the economic disadvantaged Anglos, if you look at the pipeline data, it drops down to about 30%. So it's really that population that's economically disadvantaged, which in our state, as it is throughout the country, highly disproportionately ethnic minority and Hispanic and African American. Yes. But I think if we use the term economic disadvantage, we are focused on where the issue is, because the outcomes, the chance of that group actually graduating is less than about 9% after 6 years. And that outcome it does not lead to a competitive workforce.
If you look at the data that we put together for the Houston Endowment when Larry came up with this idea of the number, the biggest factor in low completion rates all through the pipeline is poverty. It's a more important factor than ethnicity. I agree with you.
Right. And so then in the sense is, I mean, at least how we put together a report that not only reflects the data of what we've just talked about, but also makes the political proposition of why more resources and better policies, even though those resources essentially are disproportionately going to come from a different ethnic group than where the dollars are going to be spent, is absolutely indispensable if we're going to have a different outcome. Because if that doesn't happen, it's not going to happen. So. Yes, Ramon.
Dr. Perez, in this committee, we're charged with what we're going to be doing in higher education. But as you just said, we're impacted by the number of graduates and the preparedness of the students that are coming out of the schools, out of the public schools. Are you suggesting that this committee can say something or to bring some recommendations in regards to the achievement of the secondary education system?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think certainly one of the things this committee can do is call for a much higher level of cooperation between K through 12 and higher education, as well as among K through 12 education, higher education, the workforce. there is a lot we can do to improve the cooperation between the two sectors. Shirley knows this fact quite well, but there was a study done about 6 years ago by, I think it was Education Week magazine, and the magazine surveyed university and college faculty as well as high school teachers and asked a very simple question. How well do high schools do in preparing students to go to college? And the response from high school teachers was that approximately 80% said we do either a good or very good job. The response from the college and university faculty was exactly the opposite. 20% said that high schools did a good or very good job. There are very different expectations of what post-secondary readiness is between high schools and colleges and universities. We have to talk more effectively, we have to talk more regularly, and we have to work much more closely together.
But, Commissioner, it's not a secret. I mean, you could look at your higher ed remedial studies budgets. I mean, it's not a question without an answer. Why the disconnect? Well, obviously the two cultures evolved very, very differently. What could go into that issue? I've said, Larry knows this, that one of the tragedies of the American educational system, and specifically the relationship between higher education and public education, is the more prestigious the university, the less likely it is to be interested in preparing teachers, for example. The vast majority of teachers don't come out of UT Austin, they don't come out of A&M, they don't come out of Rice, Harvard, Stanford. They come out of what used to be normal schools. And they have very different standards for admission, very different levels of rigor and so forth. And when Schlueter was with us about a year and a half ago, he said, you Americans keep focusing on the wrong issues. You focus on issues like class size, you focus on the length of the school day or the school year. And he said the fundamental problem you have in terms of competing internationally is the quality of your teaching force in K through 12.
I'd like to add something to the question you just posed, Bernie, which is why the disconnect. I think it's very important for us to, as a state, to recognize that disconnect is there. And actually also to recognize that it's probably not going away anytime soon. In my judgment, I think what the commissioner just said is absolutely right, but I think the reason the disconnect exists is because schools, K to 12, are controlled locally. And because they are controlled locally, there's a tremendous patchwork of what the expectation is of achievement going out. Some districts produce very highly qualified students, and some districts do not. There's definitely a linkage with poverty in that because of what districts can afford and whether they can retain the best teachers that they get. But that local control isn't going to change in American society anytime soon, but it produces a lot of variability in student arrival at the university. Universities' admission standards and their expectations are mostly set by a national system of accreditation. So you've got one group of people over here expecting one level of attainment. You have another group of people over here managing locally, producing at a different level of attainment, and that is where the disconnect happens. It's not criminal. It's behavioral. And in my view, we are on the higher education side going to have to take greater responsibility than we have for reducing and eliminating that disconnect. I think we're going to have to work at it professionally. We've mostly finger pointed, but I don't think we can afford that anymore. I think we're going to have to address it, and Raymond and I have had that conversation too.
Yes, Charlie. No, we do. We're fine.
Just to piggyback on what Raymond said, when I was Commissioner of Education, we worked so hard on the P16, P20 to begin the dialogue. And when Dr. Predis walked into the TA building, it was, what's he here for? Then when I walked in over here, they said, "Oh my God, they're going to move the higher ed coordinating board over to the TA building." So we had to appear together in many platforms. We went every year to TASA, TASB, which is when all your public school leaders and school board members come, and we co-presented and talked about this pipeline and coordination and communication and cooperation. And that's why I mentioned, I think, at the very first meeting, we've got these P16, P20 councils that are out there to break down those barriers. But at the end of the day, it is a lot of this, and it's about money and about standards, because there are always state standards, then there are national standards, and we try to work through that with NAEP, through SAT, through ACT, and we're always trying to raise the bar. But it has to start at the state level. You're absolutely correct. It has to start here. And somehow I wish we could get that in our plan and push that. I don't know, since I've been out of it for so long, I don't know how the P16 councils are going, if they're still as active as they were when you and I were commissioners together.
I don't think they are, by and large.
And we even testified before the ledge because we wanted to let them see. We see the big picture. We know we both have room to grow, but it has to start with building relationships and being honest and talking about the problem and getting high school teachers to sit down with community college teachers and with four-year university teachers or the technical school professors and teachers and talk about where the problems are. And, we've done a lot with dual credit. I think has helped that tremendously. Of course, the course offerings with I'm trying to think, not honors courses, but AP courses have helped tremendously. But we have miles to.
Gary.
I do think that what could happen in some ways, though, is that incentives could be aligned so that, particularly when you're talking about community colleges, that it's always good for our community college to be involved with a school district who does dual credit. That's good for the community college, obviously. I mean, what incentive could the state give to a school district to enroll more people in dual credit programs? Because, in my experience, some school districts are excited about their students being having dual credit, and some school districts aren't. So what incentive could the state then give to school districts that would align those incentives that community colleges get for additional enrollment? So, I don't know that I have the answer, but whenever you have a problem like that, basically what you do is try to align the incentives and make it good for both sides.
A few more minutes here, so.
Let me say, I would say just one thing about universities, since I think they shouldn't always be. I think universities play a role in this, in the sense that the reality is in the university system, the senior university system, is that you work as hard as you can to teach as little as you can and to teach as high a level students as you can. And that, frankly, gets rewarded in a variety of ways in most universities. And I think that the person who's a great teacher, who teaches 3 or 4 sections, large sections of biology 101, has to have their own rewards, because we don't really reward those very well in the higher education system, at least not any of the places, and I say any of the places I've been. I think higher education needs to step up and say this is part of our issue as well, and we've got to be engaged, and we may have to look at our incentive system if we want to solve this as a state or as a nation.
Some of the numbers that we saw from our first presenter on the cost of higher education in the United States versus anywhere else in the developed world. It's got to raise some questions on productivity. I think comments about tuition being a barrier to success raises at least issues on my mind on are there some policy recommendations, maybe along the line of incentives? I've tried to use the word incentivizing the pipeline. So where in the pipeline can you incentivize either institutions, and the pipeline is, you could argue, is a K through 16 pipeline. Where can you incentivize institutions and or individuals for the individuals to be better prepared and better perform, and for the institutions to really take a focus that goes all the way down the pipeline. If you're a university president, are we better off as a state political unit if that president goes to bed at night and wakes up in the morning thinking, I'm going to get paid ultimately by the number of completions here, and so I need to plan and organize. I need to reach down the pipeline to my K through 12 supply chain, and I need to work on that supply chain because I'm ultimately dependent on that for our resources that we ultimately gather. So is that a way to incentivize more productivity? But certainly the data we looked at would argue that we're spending more than maybe what we're accomplishing. And so how do we get more bang for the buck?
But I'll just say one more thing. I think I would argue that when we look at where we are and what we've done on college funding, we've also got to stand up and say we've got to restore some of this funding if we're going to be more successful as we go forward. We can't add the number of students we're adding, continue to cut. We made some restorations last session, but we're still way below what we should be. And we can't do that and then complain. We can't cut and then complain that tuition is going up because there's no alternative. And if we want to have affordable education that is completed, we need to raise the budget, and we need to ensure that that addresses the needs of Texas.
Yes, Bob.
I'd just like to follow up on that comment as well as the one that was a little earlier today in the report, and that is focusing on low-income students. If that's where the future is, we darn well better have that first and foremost up there in terms of strategies and how we move forward in here, because without that, all the rest of it just doesn't seem to play out over a period of time.
Okay, last, Larry, do you have any more to...
No, I was going to follow up what Steve said. I think it's important when you're looking at the OECD charts that when he gives tuition, I think what he's doing is giving you a net cost to students following subsidy. So what's happened in the U.S. is reflecting not only price growth in the U.S., which has not been small, but also retreats from the subsidy side.
Yeah, funding.
There are no more comments. I would like to organizationally, I think we had a very good meeting, our third meeting. I was very impressed with our two contributors today. I think they set a very high standard. I would hope that Raymond and David and the rest of the staff, and the members can continue to innovate and come up with that, maintain that quality as far as our contributors, because I think it'll definitely contribute to the outcome of our report. You had distributed that article with the two UT professors, just given the national prominence, but the fact that they're also hopefully local and accessible. I would certainly recommend that presentation would be very important. And I think we've had other dialogue from others. There was a few people mentioned today by our presenters that we might want to see whether they're accessible. I think the Skype worked very effectively today. We got the message. It's maybe not quite the same thing as they're sitting there, but given the challenges and cost of transportation, I thought this worked very well.
We were talking during one of the presentations, David and Gardner and Susan Brown and I, and we're going to try to get James Heckman, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist that University of Chicago has been doing a lot of work recently on the value and the return on investment in both public education and higher education. He's done a lot of research on how students succeed and what children need and poor kids need in order to be successful. We're going to try to get them to come here.
Can I just thank Raymond? Thank you and your staff. You take such good care of us. Our meals have been fabulous. It was great having all this before us today and being able to follow along. And I know that doesn't just happen overnight. So your staff is doing a great job. And we appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Here they are.
Yes, David.
I'd just like to encourage you. You should have received an invitation to a meeting on July 11th about new delivery systems in higher education. If you're able to attend that, I would encourage you. It's going to have some very good speakers, such as you had today, but focusing on that topic. If not, we will have that taped and available to you to view. But if you're able to make it, you're welcome. Just let us know and we can register for you so you don't have to do that. July 11th, it'll be at the AT&T Center at the University of Texas.
Thank you. And I guess one final comment is we get a lot of input. We build a consensus on this committee, and we try to communicate. We need to remember a part of what we're trying to communicate is a political statement. I mean, it's trying to argue for policies or interventions that is going to change outcomes. And we need to keep in mind we need to convince people, whether they're political leaders or in the legislature or business leaders. I mean, it's important that whatever consensus we build here, we're able to communicate in a way that we can build a bigger consensus, because it's only by building that bigger consensus will we build support for what's needed to bring about a better outcome. So I want to thank everybody today for being here and look forward to seeing you in a month. I think we're on the, I think it's the 18th of June. Very good. Thank you very much.